when we think of some of the best positions in MMA, we think about these dominant positions or positions where it's hard to actually get attacked on, or different kind of submission attempts or even strikes you can land on the opponent. But one we don't think about is this one. Looks kinda odd. You would never think someone in this kind of position would have an advantage over the opponent, but over the years we've seen fighters take that position and nothing happens to them. And we all wonder why. To the fans, it looks like the fighter on the ground there is actually in a bad position, but because of the rule set in MMA, it's actually a fantastic position to take because there's very little vulnerabilities due to the rules where you cannot soccer kick them, you cannot knee them, you cannot stomp, you can't hit the back of the head, and anything you attempt to do to that fighter also brings you into a vulnerable position as well, where that is not true for most positions in MMA. This is an extension to the ground touch immunity position, or as we call playing the game, where the opponent, if they're in a position where they can get kneed to the head, they just simply touch the ground with their hands, and now they are immune to knees. And no one plays the game better than Aljamain. I mean, for real, this guy really won the belt off of playing the game. But there's no knock on him because it's a don't hate the player, hate the game kind of situation. He's only doing that because the rules allow him to do it. He's using it to his benefit, and it's not going to change unless the rules change. Once the rules change, he will also adapt to them. He doesn't need that technique in order to be a great fighter. Very silly rule in my opinion, but this position is even more abusable because they are completely on the ground, making them even less vulnerable to a variety of different strikes compared to someone who's standing and just touching the ground. While they are laying on the ground, you would have to get yourself into their range to get grappled. That's the only way you could put up any kind of offense. They can ankle pick, rise into a single, and you can't even really strike with them without exposing yourself to a takedown. This causes fighters to want to walk away from them, which is going to let the opponent up. What some of the best fighters have found out recently is that they can get down on this position after failing on a takedown to take a breather. Anytime they want, they can do that. And also, this will reset the fight if they're not in the position they want on the feet, because the ref will just back the standing fighter away, which is taking away the pressure that they put on the grappler. And the reason why so many people are put off from this certain technique is because it's one of the only things in the sport that doesn't represent an actual fight accurately. If you do this in a real fight, you will only get hurt for it. We like to think of MMA as the only place you can actually find out who is the best fighter. Every technique we see in the sport is something that represents an actual fight. You know, you use these certain techniques, they all work in a real fight, but then you see this. This and this are the only things that don't represent a real fight. You do that, you're gonna get kneed or punted in the face. That's why people are so turned off from it, because it's such an unnatural position to take in order to take advantage of the fight. This is such a powerful tactic that's getting used right now that already is getting taken advantage of due to the poor rule set. Why don't you see this problem in ONE Championship, Ryzen, and even Pride back in the day? You never saw fighters do this. You did see it in Strikeforce, you did see it in Bellator, you are seeing it in the UFC. It's because of one technique. One technique they allowed in those other organizations, and that is the grounded knee. This takes away that entire immunity, and it causes the fighter to constantly be in a fight, not resetting the fight whenever they want. We see multiple fighters do this. Nick Diaz back in the day when he fought Paul Daly. Aljamain Sterling intelligently uses this to his fighting style every so often, playing the game very well, using the rules to the maximum effect, and also failed takedown attempts where the opponent's under the opponent. It also draws that fighter on top who doesn't want to wrestle, but successfully did defend the takedown, to have to grapple with the opponent more. Because of so little vulnerabilities and how the rule set is formed, this has caused a trend of spamming takedowns that cannot be addressed other than further grappling with that opponent, landing minimal punches, or trying to disengage completely, which can lead up to even more grappling. This is leaving strikers in complete disarray from opportunities of using their strengths, even though they have successfully defended a takedown. And because of this, failed takedown attempts are now actually rewarded. Keep shooting takedowns until one lands successfully. The only way to react to this tactic is to grapple back or disengage completely. In no other discipline is failing techniques rewarded. You miss a strike, now you're vulnerable to not only get counter-struck, but also get taken to the ground as well. You fail a submission attempt, and most of the time, you are risking your position to do so, even while you're on top. Although there are a few failed submission attempts that don't risk much, depending on how it failed, like the arm triangle or a top position Kimura, but those usually require very dominant top positions to even begin with. And even so, there are a lot of different kind of ways to escape that, reversing the position on the opponent. The only thing in MMA right now that is rewarded for even failing are shooting takedowns. You shoot and it fails, while the opponent now has to either grapple with a submission, or wrestle for a better position, or simply get away. If the opponent tries to go for a submission, now they also risk their position to do so. They try to wrestle, which could cause further wrestling dominance from the opponent who shot that takedown, because fighters who are going to shoot multiple takedowns like that are normally good wrestlers. That is their game plan. They want to keep that motion going of constantly shooting takedowns. We've seen many examples of this happen. If the opponent stuffs the takedown and tries to get a better wrestling position, now they are exactly doing what that wrestler wants, bringing you to their world. It's only going to cause a better wrestler to stop someone doing that. Now, if you try to get away, the wrestler simply shoots again and again, and this process is going to keep repeating. They have to get away, they have to attempt a submission, or wrestle with the wrestler. Most strikers are going to try to get away. Eventually, one of these takedowns are going to get them to the ground, or they get shoved into the fence, restricting their space to defend it effectively, making this whole rule set so advantageous to wrestlers. This is something people have talked about for many years now, that the way the rules are in MMA, it's very much catering to the wrestling style. Some will say that the scoring changes have taken away from the wrestlers because damage and submissions are being more important for scoring a fight, but in fact, this new change to scoring has also helped wrestlers win decisions tremendously due to the ground and pound being rewarded heavier than ever before. The best wrestlers are going to have the best ground and pound as well. And with damage from ground and pound being so dominant today, this change from the scoring has also even benefited wrestlers heavily. They could just get better when it comes to submissions, but it requires way more than the spamming of takedowns tactics, you know? A striker who has successfully sprawled the takedown gets no reward for it. They have to either disengage completely while risking having to stuff another immediate takedown, or continue to grapple with the grappler. There is a solution to this that we've seen in other organizations, something I personally have been wanting for a long time because I love the pride rules. Add at least knees to a grounded opponent. I like soccer kicks and stomps personally, but I can see how that's a bit too far. Knees to a grounded opponent is a natural solution on adding strikes for the striker as a reward for stuffing a takedown. This will not only give defending the takedown a reward for doing so, it would give a solution to the frustrating spamming of takedowns we are seeing so often in the sport right now, and it would make things more enjoyable for the fans to watch as well. It brings a new level of danger to fights that would have to make them a lot more aware of just keep shooting and failing takedowns. If you fail a takedown, now you can get knee to the dome for it. So they have to become a lot more intelligent on how they're shooting and when they're shooting, rather than just shooting like crazy until one works. One could say, yeah, but a striker does have punches, but potentially punching at the opponent from this position is not a good answer because number one, a sprawling punch, if you lay on top of the wrestler and throw punches at them, they lack any kind of power to throw off that grappler, so it would eventually resort to more grappling sequences to further the action. There are standing punches. While being powerful enough to throw off the grappler, it does put the striker in a vulnerable and off-balancing stance that can cause them to get easily taken down. Their legs are right there for the taking. Ankle picks, rising to singles, shooting another double. There's a lot of options for the wrestler to continue after their failed takedown attempt if that striking opponent is trying to land standing punches. Taking that grounded knee away from when the Pride rules had it, and even One Championship right now has it, and I believe Ryzen does as well. Taking that away in the UFC and Bellator has restricted the striker's solution to counter takedowns. Adding this actually would even give wrestlers in the side control or the entirely vacant north-south position a reward for getting such a dominant position on their opponent. If you can get north-south or side control on a fighter, you've done so many things correct, that fighter on the bottom has done so many things wrong, you should be rewarded with throwing knees at them. Grounded knees is such a situational and honestly only a rewarded technique that cannot be abused like other techniques. Grounded knees only work when you get a good position on the opponent that you worked for. Stopping takedowns, getting into side control, getting to north-south. While they're on the ground, they're trying to stand up and you pin them up against the fence, you could drive knees into them as well. It's a technique that you only get to use because you did so many things correct. A grounded knee is a reward. It's not something you could just throw whenever you want. That is why I do believe grounded knees should be added. Now, it could seem like, oh, we're punishing the fighters that are playing the game right now that are using the rules to their advantage, but this should have been part of the rules forever. This is not just something new. We've had other organizations that actually made this legal, and it turned out to be perfect. We had some of the best fights of all time, and it made fighters a lot more intelligent on how to use their wrestling effectively. Instead of just shooting like crazy, it's actually insane to think about that failing takedowns is rewarded for. That should never even be a thing. If a technique you throw out there fails, it needs to have a counter to it. You should not be rewarded for doing that. And right now, takedowns is the only thing where that actually exists, and fighters are using that to their advantage. Now, this is more of a hate the game, not the player kind of thing, because fighters should do exactly what they need to do in order to win a fight, and if it is abusing that rule set, they should absolutely do so. It shows their fight IQ. But the rule set in general needs to change, and it's not just the ground and knees. There's many stuff like 12 to 6 elbows still needs to change. A bunch of the scoring criteria still needs to change. There's a lot of stuff in the rule set that needs to change, but the ground and knees now is another part where I see a lot of fans right now are being aware of. They're like, okay, that position that fighter is taking like that should not be advantageous. Shooting takedowns constantly with no detriment, you're only being rewarded for doing it, should not be a thing either. That doesn't make any sense, because it's such a unnatural position to have an advantage in. And one of the most natural counters to this is not being allowed. Dominic Cruz, of course Henry Cejudo, and back in the day, many fighters from Pride FC were very vocal about adding soccer kicks, stomps, or ground and knees or something like that to the mix that would weaken the dominance that wrestlers have in the sport right now. It give more strength to the striker, because strikers have very little tools when it comes to the ground. They have to grapple or wrestle when the fight is on the ground, but adding knees or something changes that entirely, where now the striker has something they can work with, because wrestlers have tools they can use on the feet and on the ground. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu artists have weapons they can use on the feet and on the ground. It's just strikers that don't. There are elbows and stuff like that they can use while getting on top, but that will require them to be a better wrestler or Jiu-Jitsu artist than the opponent, whereas the wrestler does not need to be a better striker in order to use their wrestling effectively on the feet, and the same thing for the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu artists. They don't need to be a better striker in order to use their tools effectively against the opponent. For strikers, we have to ask them to also be a better wrestler to use their strikes on the ground. And none of that is fair to the fighters, because that's what the rule set is for. It is to be fair to all disciplines. It's to be fair to all fighters.